2 weeks ago, the man who once led an impeachment charge against Governor Siminalayi Fubara stood up in the Rivers State House of Assembly and did something nobody expected him to do quietly. He called for a vote and he let Fubara's spending plan pass. Martin Amaewhule, Speaker of the Rivers State House of Assembly, the lawmaker the entire country still associates with the word Wike-Loyalist, looked at a budget framework submitted by the governor he tried to remove from office, and instead of blocking it, he criticized it for being late and then approved it anyway. If you've been following Rivers politics, your instinct is probably to assume this is peace, that the war is over, that Wike and Fubara have finally made their truce real. But here's the question nobody in the press conferences is asking out loud. If this is really peace, why did the Speaker spend more time publicly scolding the governor for the delay than celebrating the cooperation? And why, 6 months after Tinubu personally brokered final reconciliation, is Rivers State only now passing a budget framework for a year that is already half over? Something doesn't add up, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what Amaewhule's approval really signals, not about peace, but about power. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. Let's establish exactly what happened, because the headlines have been doing a lot of the audience's thinking for them. On Thursday, June 25, 2026, Governor Fubara transmitted Rivers State's 2026 to 2028 Medium Term Expenditure Framework, the MTEF, to the House of Assembly. This is the document that legally has to precede any state budget. It lays out revenue projections, expenditure assumptions, and the fiscal roadmap government spending is supposed to follow for the next 3 years. Speaker Amaewhule read the governor's letter into the record, and the House leader, Major Jack, laid the document before lawmakers. Less than 24 hours later, barely enough time for a serious legislative body to read a 3-year fiscal document, let alone scrutinize it, the Assembly held an emergency plenary and passed it. Voice vote, unanimous according to the chamber. The framework projects a 2026 budget of roughly 1.84 trillion naira, with over 1.4 trillion naira earmarked for capital projects. Now here's where it gets interesting. Before the vote, and again after it, Amaewhule did something a true ally wouldn't bother doing. He went on record blasting Fubara for the delay. He cited Section 10 Sub 1 Sub B of the Rivers State Fiscal Responsibility Law, which required this document to be laid before the House by September 2025, 9 months earlier. His words were pointed: the year is already half gone. He approved the framework not as an act of trust, but explicitly in the interest of the state, language that reads less like camaraderie and more like a man building a paper trail. Why does timing matter here? Because Rivers State has effectively been operating without a properly passed 2026 budget for 6 months. During the emergency rule period, Tinubu's administration presented a budget to the Senate on the state's behalf through the sole administrator. But once democratic governance resumed, that budget's legal standing became murky, and the state risked drifting into exactly the kind of constitutional vacuum that triggered the last crisis. So this isn't a new political war breaking out. This is the tail end of a 18-month saga, Wike versus Fubara, Godfather versus Godson, finally producing a functional, if uneasy, legislative outcome. The question is, what kind of outcome it actually is. To understand why this approval matters, you need to understand the institutional terrain it sits on. The Rivers State House of Assembly is not, on paper, supposed to be an extension of any single politician. Constitutionally, it exists to check the executive, to scrutinize spending, pass laws, and represent constituents. But since 2023, this assembly has functioned almost entirely as a proxy battlefield. 27 of its 32 lawmakers defected from the PDP to the APC in loyalty to Wike, triggering a legal fight over whether their seats were even valid under Nigeria's anti-defection laws, a fight that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The presidency, under Section 305 of the 1999 Constitution, has the power to declare a state of emergency when normal governance breaks down. Tinubu used that power on March 18, 2025, suspending Fubara, his deputy, and the entire assembly for 6 months, and installing a retired naval chief, Vice Admiral Ibok Ete Ibas, as sole administrator. Critics, including opposition figures like Atiku Abubakar and Peter Obi, called this unconstitutional, arguing the constitution doesn't actually permit removing an elected governor this way. That debate was never fully resolved in court. It was resolved politically by Tinubu lifting the emergency rule in September 2025 once a backroom peace strike was struck. That's the deeper institutional problem this story exposes. In Rivers State, the formal constitutional process, courts, the assembly's independent function, due legislative process, has repeatedly been bypassed in favor of closed-door settlements brokered at Aso Rock. The MTEF approval we're examining today followed that exact same pattern. It wasn't resolved by legislative debate on the merits. It was resolved because the political terms dictated that it should pass quickly, with public grumbling attached for the record. So when you ask, where does legitimate authority end and overreach begin? The honest answer is, in Rivers, those lines have been redrawn by political negotiation more than by constitutional text. The assembly has functioned as designed in the narrow sense. It debated, it voted, it passed a document, but it has not functioned independently. Every major legislative action in this assembly since 2023 has tracked the state of the Wike-Fubara relationship, not the state of Rivers' fiscal needs.
This is where the real chess game is happening, and where Amaewhule's vote needs to be read carefully, because on the surface, it looks like submission, but strategically, it's something closer to controlled exposure. Start with who benefits. Fubara gets a governing state again, finally able to point to a fiscal framework and move toward an actual appropriation bill, ending 6 months of operating in a legal gray zone. For a governor whose entire post-emergency rule survival strategy has been cooperate, don't confront, this is a tangible win he can show Rivers people. I am governing again. Wike, watching from the Federal Capital Territory Ministry, also wins, but differently. His instruction to Amaewhule wasn't really about the MTEF's content. It was about demonstrating publicly and repeatedly that nothing moves in Rivers State legislative business without his loyalist consent. The assembly approving Fubara's plan isn't proof that Wike has stepped back. It's proof that Wike's faction still controls the choke point and chose this time to let the governor through it. That is arguably a stronger statement of dominance than blocking it would have been. Blocking creates crisis, which invites federal intervention and scrutiny. Allowing it to pass while publicly chastising the governor for incompetence achieves control without the political cost of another emergency rule. Amaewhule himself has a personal calculation layered on top of the factional one. He has reportedly been told by sources close to the presidency that any future drama in Rivers threatens his own standing. Tinubu has made clear more than once that he wants this particular fire extinguished ahead of 2027. By approving the MTEF while simultaneously going on record blaming Fubara for the delay, Amaewhule positions himself as the reasonable institutionalist, the speaker who put the interest of the state first, even when the governor failed to meet his legal obligations. That's a useful reputation to bank going into 2027, regardless of which faction ultimately prevails. And this is where the 2027 calculation becomes unavoidable. Multiple reports from the reconciliation period describe Fubara as having agreed, under presidential pressure, to not seek re-election in 2027. Wike, meanwhile, has publicly told supporters Rivers people are battle-ready for 2027 and has accused Fubara of reneging on parts of their private agreement. Read against that backdrop, Amaewhule's cooperation on the budget is not a ceasefire. It's Wike's faction allowing Fubara enough rope to govern competently for the remainder of a term he isn't expected to seek again, because a visibly dysfunctional River State under Fubara would also reflect badly on Wike's own political brand ahead of 2027, and because a smoothly governed state is easier to hand off to a Wike-anointed successor than one in permanent crisis. Who's conspicuously quiet here? The presidency. Tinubu, who personally brokered this peace and who has twice intervened to halt impeachment proceedings against Fubara, has said almost nothing publicly about the MTEF passage itself. That silence is its own signal. Aso Rock doesn't need to comment on a process that is behind the scenes still moving exactly the way it was instructed to. Why should a viewer outside Rivers care about a budget framework vote? Because Rivers is one of Nigeria's most economically consequential states, a major oil-producing region whose revenue performance affects federal allocation calculations, investor confidence in the Niger Delta, and the broader narrative of whether Tinubu's emergency rule precedent was a one-time fix or a template. If a sitting president can suspend an elected governor and an entire state assembly for 6 months, install an appointee, and then have that arrangement quietly normalized once a political deal is struck, that is a federal state power balance question for every governor in the federation, not just Fubara. Economically, the MTEF itself revealed something worth flagging. Amaewhule openly criticized the document's revenue projections as too conservative relative to prevailing international crude prices. That's not a small technical quibble. Rivers' entire capital budget, more than 1.4 trillion naira of it, depends on accurate oil revenue forecasting. If the framework understates expected income, the state either underspends on development or has to scramble for supplementary appropriations later. The same dysfunction that has already cost Rivers a year of normal budgeting. On security, a river state that drifts back into legislative gridlock is a river state more vulnerable to the kind of pipeline vandalism Tinubu cited as part of his original justification for emergency rule. Stable budgeting and stable governance are not abstract good governance talking points here. They're tied directly to the state's ability to fund security operations in the creeks. And for ordinary Rivers people, the ones nowhere near Aso Rock's negotiating table, 6 months without a passed budget means 6 months of delayed capital projects, stalled contracts, and uncertainty for state workers and contractors who depend on government spending cycles. The elite reconciliation that produced this MTEF vote was structurally about protecting Wike's and Fubara's respective political futures. Whether it produces functional governance for the roughly 5 million people living in Rivers is a separate question entirely, and one this assembly's track record gives reason to watch closely rather than assume. Rivers State's stability matters beyond Nigeria's borders for one simple reason. It sits at the heart of the country's oil and gas export infrastructure, which makes it relevant to international energy markets and to foreign investors already wary of Nigeria's broader fiscal and security picture. For the diaspora, particularly Rivers indigents in the UK, US, and Canada, who have watched this crisis unfold from a distance for 2 years, the key thing to understand is that what looks like resolution in the headlines is, on the ground, a negotiated truce between two power centers, rather than a restoration of normal democratic competition. International observers tracking Nigeria's broader democratic trajectory ahead of 2027 will read this episode as one more data point in a pattern. Executive emergency powers used to break political deadlocks, followed by informal elite bargains rather than judicial or electoral resolution. That pattern, resolving constitutional crises through negotiated settlement rather than courts, is not unique to Nigeria, but it is one African governance analysts increasingly flag as a marker of how durable a country's democratic institutions actually are under pressure.
Let's steelman the optimistic reading, because it deserves to be taken seriously before we challenge it. The strongest case for genuine reconciliation goes like this. Fubara has now governed cooperatively with this assembly for 9 months since his reinstatement, with no fresh emergency rule and visible legislative output. First, the screening of commissioner nominees, now the MTEF. If this were purely theatre, critics would argue, Wike's loyalists could have continued obstructing indefinitely, the way they did for most of 2024 and early 2025. The fact that they didn't suggests the underlying relationship has genuinely stabilized, even if Amaewhule's public criticism was simply honest institutional commentary, rather than coded messaging. That's a fair point, and it shouldn't be dismissed. Sustained cooperation over 9 months is meaningfully different from a single staged handshake. The most common misconception circulating on social media, though, is the binary framing, that this is either total peace or total war, that Amaewhule's vote means Wike has fully released his grip on rivers or is secretly plotting Fubara's downfall again. Neither extreme captures what's actually happening. The more accurate read is that Rivers State has settled into a managed equilibrium. Fubara governs day to day, Wike's faction retains structural leverage through the assembly and continues using it to extract concessions and shape the political narrative. And both sides have a shared, overriding interest in avoiding another crisis that would invite renewed federal intervention before 2027. What this means for Rivers' democratic trajectory specifically is sobering when you say it plainly. The state's legislative and executive branches are not functioning as constitutionally independent actors checking each other. They are functioning as two factions of the same political machine, temporarily aligned because the machine's senior partner has decided alignment currently serves him better than conflict. That arrangement can produce calm. It does not, by itself, produce accountable governance. So what happens next? 3 moves to watch. First, expect Fubara to move quickly to formally present the full 2026 appropriation bill, likely within the coming weeks, and expect the Assembly to pass it with similar speed, continuing the pattern of approval paired with public criticism of the executive's timeline or figures. Watch whether Amaewhule's faction uses that process to extract specific concessions, appointments, contract allocations, or commitments tied to 2027 positioning. Second, watch Wike's public rhetoric over the coming months. His December 2025 comments accusing Fubara of reneging on their private agreement and his warnings that Rivers people are battle-ready for 2027 suggests the underlying tension has not actually dissolved. It has simply been redirected away from legislative obstruction and toward the 2027 succession question. If Wike begins publicly naming or promoting a preferred 2027 candidate, that's the clearest signal yet that this MTEF-era cooperation was always a holding pattern, not a resolution. Third, watch the presidency's posture. Tinubu has twice personally intervened to prevent this crisis from reigniting, most recently in January 2026 when he halted fresh impeachment moves against Fubara. With Rivers' strategic importance to 2027 calculations, expect continued behind-the-scenes presidential management of this relationship rather than a hands-off approach, meaning any future flare-up is likely to be diffused quickly again, not allowed to escalate into another emergency rule. This de-escalates if Fubara continues delivering visible governance wins without challenging Wike's structural dominance, and if Wike concludes a stable, functioning River State serves his 2027 interests better than continued disruption. It escalates if Fubara shows any sign of reconsidering his reported commitment not to seek re-election, or if Wike's faction concludes that a managed crisis would better position their preferred succession plan. Over a 12-month horizon, expect continued uneasy cooperation through the 2026 budget cycle. Over a 3-year horizon, the real test isn't this MTEF vote at all. It's whether River State reaches the 2027 election cycle without this arrangement collapsing back into open warfare. So, back to the question we opened with. Why did Wike's loyalists approve Fubara's plan? Not because the war is over. Because for now, controlled cooperation serves both men's interests better than open conflict. Fubara gets to govern, Wike gets to demonstrate that governing still happens on his terms, and neither has to risk another federal intervention that could complicate their 2027 calculations. This was never a vote about a fiscal framework. It was a vote about who still holds the leverage in Rivers, and the answer, delivered through gritted teeth and public criticism, was the same as it has been since 2023. I want to hear your read on this. Is this genuine institutional maturity finally taking hold in Rivers, or a temporary truce waiting for its expiration date? Tell me where you think this goes before 2027. One thing to watch for in the next video, what happens when Fubara actually presents the full appropriation bill and whether Amaewhule's assembly extracts something specific in exchange for passing it. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.